Okay, we'll go ahead and get started here. Thank you all for coming. I'm Tony Mills, a senior fellow here at AEI, and also director of our new Center for Technology, Science, and Energy. It's a pleasure to have you here. Thank you all who are watching online as well. For today's event, which is co-hosted with the New Atlantis, titled "Is Climate Change to Blame for Natural Disasters? The Science and Politics of Extreme Weather." The goal of the Center for Technology, Science, and Energy here at AEI is to cultivate the intellectual and moral resources for our nation's leaders to think and act prudently in the face of the dizzying array of issues posed by science and technology today. Now, climate change surely is high on the list of those public policy issues that are not only dizzying, but also in dire need of well-informed and morally grounded thinking, as well as prudential action. So what better topic for us to consider tonight? Before I introduce our panel, I want to say a little bit about the goals of the event and what we're hoping to accomplish. Yesterday, a New York Times headline declared, "Climate doom is out, apocalyptic optimism is in," with a subtitle, "Focusing on natural disaster hasn't changed the planet's trajectory. Will a more upbeat approach show a way forward?" Judging by the laughter that induced, that sentiment may be welcome, but most of you, I'm sure, will be surprised to hear that doom is out. Catastrophism seems everywhere in our policy debates today, particularly, though not only, when it comes to climate change. This catastrophism is particularly evident, I think, in media coverage of natural disasters and extreme weather. These are routinely attributed to man-made climate change, conjuring a hostile, unstable, and increasingly unlivable planet that is quickly overwhelming our capacity to respond and adapt. A relatively small but influential, perhaps not influential enough, group of experts, however, have been working at the intersection of environmental science and public policy for years, trying to counter this narrative. We have two of those experts here tonight, who I'll introduce in a moment. And they, along with others, including Dan Sarowitz, have been making a case for a more reasonable and pragmatic approach to environmental policy in general, and climate change in particular. One of those experts, Ted Nordhaus, recently wrote in the New Atlantis an essay which paints a rather different picture. Drawing on the peer-reviewed literature on extreme weather event attribution, literature which informs both the U.S. National Climate Assessment and the IPCC's Sixth Assessment Report, Ted argues that a closer look at the science reveals a much more nuanced reality. He suggests in particular that while climate change has affected extreme weather at the margins, infrastructure, institutions, and technology are in practice more important for determining how costly such events are in both economic and human terms. And Ted concludes that both the science and politics of extreme event attribution are inadvertently, perhaps, hampering practical solutions to address climate change and to increase our resilience to natural disasters, whatever their proximate causes. So tonight we have a terrific panel to discuss and respond to Ted's essay and the many issues it raises. We'll begin with a moderated discussion, which will last for about 45 minutes, after which we will have time for audience questions. For those in the room, please wait. Someone will come around with a microphone so that you can ask your question. For those who are tuning in virtually, you can ask a question by emailing price.stclair@aei.org or on Twitter with the hashtag #AskAEIClimate. I guess I should call it X, not Twitter. But. All right, so without further ado, I'd like to introduce the panelists, and then I'll hand it off to those who have more expertise to talk about tonight's topic than I do. So first, our moderator, Ari Schulman, who is also the co-host of tonight's event. He's the editor of the New Atlantis, the journal where Ted Nordhaus's essay appears. Ari's writings on science, politics, technology, and related topics have appeared in such outlets as the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Atlantic, and the New Republic. Next, I'm going in different order than you appear on the stage. Ted Nordhaus, who I mentioned before, in addition to authoring the essay in question, is the founder and executive director of the Breakthrough Institute, a research center that, quote, identifies and promotes technological solutions to environmental and human development challenges. Ted is also the co-author of an eco-modernist manifesto, which advocates using humanity's extraordinary powers in service of creating a good Anthropocene. I'm mentioning Ted and Roger together because Roger is also the co-author of the Eco-Modernist Manifesto. So Roger Pelkey, my colleague here at AEI, a non-resident senior fellow, where he focuses on science and technology policy, the politicization of science, government science advice, and energy and climate. Roger is also the author of The Honest Broker, Making Sense of Science and Policy and Politics, and writes a newsletter called The Honest Broker. Last but not least, we have Xiting Pomerleau, who is the Deputy Director of Climate Policy at the Niskanen Center, where her areas of research include carbon taxation, carbon border adjustments, and policies at the intersection of climate and trade. Prior to joining Niskanen, Xiting also worked in public policy at the Cato Institute and the American Council on Renewable Energy. So with that, I'll pass it over to you, Ari. Take it away.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Tony. I wanted to just start by talking very briefly about why I commissioned this piece for the New Atlantis. By the way, there are copies on your table, as well as of our just released issue. You are seeing the print edition before I am, actually. I was interested in this. The climate change story has been around for a very long time, long enough that I was being, let's say, educated on it in elementary school in the 1990s in Houston. But the nature of the narrative seemed to me to have changed in a very distinctive way just in the last couple of years. What we'd heard about most of our lives were generalized phenomenon, global beheating, the oceans are rising and will rise further. You hear a lot about projected things about wet bulb temperatures in the American Southeast, all of these kinds of things that are very high level, and a lot of them are kind of hypothetical in the future. It seemed to me that there was a moment somewhere around, I don't know, 2021 or 2022, where every time there was a new natural disaster, the main headlines on it that you would see in the New York Times, Associated Press, places like that, mainstream outlets, were suggesting that these particular disasters were somehow linked to climate, right? Or that they indicated a new climate reality, a new era of extreme weather, a new era in which extreme weather events were more likely. And I thought, this is interesting because I don't remember seeing a phase of headlines that were explaining why this new science were emerging. And as somebody who works in journalism and knows the ways that you can massage a particular conclusion that you can put in the headline and the kind of standards that you need to be able to get away with that in a piece, I went hunting and looking whenever I saw one of these pieces for what is the basis, not even in reality or in science, but just as described in the article for the claim that we're seeing here. And it was always remarkably thin. There was rarely even more than a single kind of token sentence within the body of the piece that was backing up the framing that you would see in the headline. Sometimes you wouldn't even see it in the title of the piece. Subscribe to the New York Times, you get their climate newsletter. You would get a framing in the subject line that wouldn't even appear within the title of the piece once you clicked through the email. So my suspicions went up. So I dropped Ted an email and I said, what's the story on this? Is there backing for this? And I was expecting the answer to be, I didn't know what the answer was, which is a good position to be in as an editor. I was expecting the answer to be, this is one of these classic uncertainty things, right? We're overreading the research. And Ted wrote back and said, no, this is actually answerable, which was a surprise to me. So I wanted to set that up as the motivation and ask Ted if you could maybe rehearse some of the major arguments of the piece, and in particular, what you think the underlying science of natural disaster attribution says, what we actually know about it, and how that differs from the narrative as said explicitly or implicitly over the last, say, 24 months of headlines about natural disasters.
Sure, thanks. So, I mean, I think I'm kind of like maybe, I don't know, I don't think I'm unique, but I think I'm unusual in that I think over the last like 15 years, there's a lot of people who have worked on climate change and the issue have gotten increasingly sort of catastrophic and apocalyptic about climate risk. I've gotten less so. If you went back and read what I was writing, you know, in like the mid-2000s, I myself described climate change as an existential risk to human societies. I do not any longer believe that. I think it's a problem. I think there's a lot of reasons to do something about it. But I do not think that climate change is very likely to result in the end of human societies or sort of massive, sort of catastrophic kind of global costs. And so then the question is kind of, why is that? Why did I change my mind? And really, and one of the people who was really influential is here today, on the panel today, is Roger, who's a real expert on a lot of this stuff. And I'll try not to run through too much of what he's going to say later. Also, Patrick Brown, who's here, who's worked for me, has really kind of helped me understand the actual underlying climate change, climate science. How is warming actually acting on the climate in ways that I think I didn't really understand until relatively recently. And when I say that, it's not that I didn't understand that climate change was warming the planet, warming was happening, it was then would express itself in various weather phenomena. But I think there's sort of this idea that you get a bunch of climate change and then you start having all sorts of terrible weather that only happens because of the climate change. And that is just literally not how it works. There's almost no evidence that even 3-4 degrees of warming would result in hurricanes happening where there would have been no very strong storm otherwise, or massive floods where there wouldn't have been a flood otherwise. It doesn't work like that. Climate change is always acting on the margins of these phenomena in one way or another. So it's making the heat wave hotter. It's making the cold snap not as hot. It's making an intense rainstorm somewhat more intense. It's making a strong hurricane somewhat stronger. But I think the key thing that you have to understand when you start to think about then how will this affect society is that the main event here is always already natural variability. That the climate was a dangerous place before there was climate change. It continues to be a dangerous place, and in some cases, climate change is making those dangerous things somewhat more dangerous. But it is not the case that without climate change, we would not be having very extreme, intense weather events quite frequently all over the planet. So that's sort of the first kind of key thing that sort of has shifted my understanding, and the first key point I make is that you have to start with the natural variability, and then climate change is only sort of intensifying that or affecting that on the margin in one way or another. So then the second thing is then when you try to kind of look at that and go, well, how does that then affect the costs and the impacts of these disasters on human societies? Well, you've now got a whole another set of factors that have nothing to do with the climate and have everything to do with human institutions, human technology, infrastructure, things like that. So when you start looking at the cost of disasters, when you start looking, whether it's the economic costs or the human costs, what you find is that the main thing affecting long-term trends in this is not what's happening with the weather, it's what sorts of infrastructure you have, what sorts of institutions you have, emergency response, weather forecasts, public health capabilities. There's a whole set of things that actually really determine how well any society, how resilient it is to any given natural disaster. And so you're now talking about, sort of two things in which the actual, you go from climate change sort of having an effect on the margin of the hazard, and then the hazard not actually being the primary driver that determines whether disasters are getting more or less expensive, whether many more or fewer people are dying in those disasters. And so the result of that is that when you start seeing headlines that are suggesting that climate change has something to do with any given natural disaster that's occurring, when you dig down into it, insofar as there's any basis at all to suggest that climate change had some impact on this event, it's not having that much impact on the event, and that relative difference in impact is not the thing that's determining whether it's a terrible catastrophe or just a garden variety extreme weather event that happen all the time and don't affect very many people. So that's really kind of the core, I think, point in the first half of the article. And then in the second half of the article, I sort of discuss how we got to this point where there's this sort of very broad misunderstanding of the relationship between climate change and these events. And the short version of that is that it was not accidental, it was quite intentional. Going back several decades now, and you had an environmental community that wanted to galvanize action on this, recognized that when we talked about climate change as an uncertain future risk that would affect people in the future, it was very difficult to mobilize political action. So there was a sustained effort over multiple decades to sort of move the proximity, sort of in time and space, of climate risk from the future into the present. And the way that the sort of environmental movement, with a lot of assistance from allies in the media and in academia, did that was to quite intentionally connect climate, extreme weather events and natural disasters to climate change. And this is not sort of some kind of me making up a conspiracy. It's all out in plain sight. And I particularly focus on one, I think, quite influential convened by the Union of Concerned Scientists in 2011, a series of workshops. And they go and they published the actual proceedings. Here is our thing about how to get everyone more concerned with climate change. And it is literally to go and essentially invent a new science of climate attribution that use what I would consider sort of statistical sleight of hand to make kind of pretty misleading claims about the way that climate change was affecting extreme events. Ones that could be sort of colorably defensible, but that were broadly misunderstood in terms of what they were actually saying. And then also sort of an effort to then kind of tag that representation of the risk to sort of a villain. And that villain was the fossil fuel industry. And that is not to say the fossil fuel industry does not and has not for a very long time produced a product that is combusted and leads to warming. But there's a quite intentional effort to kind of show that fossil fuel companies and interests were sort of trying to sort of mislead the public, tie that to litigation. And the purpose of the litigation was not that like they were going to bankrupt Exxon. The purpose of the litigation was essentially to sort of withdraw the social license to create this sense that we were all being, it came right out of the tobacco playbook, and it went, we're all being manipulated by these sort of profit-hungry corporate interests that are literally responsible for, the hurricane yesterday that came through your town. I won't get into sort of the culpability, in terms of what Exxon did or didn't do in the 80s or 90s, but that effort was quite connected to how it would affect public perceptions of the relationship between climate change and events that were happening right now in the present, with the belief that doing so would motivate action to address the problem. And again, you can I make a case that I don't think that strategy ever was very well conceived in terms of how public opinion would actually work on the issue. But I'll stop there, and I'll just say one other thing, because we're going to go to Roger. And I think Roger has sort of become, for a lot of people in the climate space, sort of a bête noire for a long time now. And the reason for that, going back to the mid-2000s, is because Roger was the guy, more than anyone else, who kind of got in the way of this effort to start doing the attribution, to start attributing rising costs from natural disasters to climate change, and going back to the middle of the 2000s, Roger publishes and testifies and does other things, saying there's just no evidence for this, using the normalized methodology that he'll talk about. So if you want to understand why Roger becomes this flashpoint very, very early on in the climate debate, it's because he kind of got in the way of this effort to kind of re-describe climate risk in the ways that now have become sort of everyday fodder on the sort of headlines of major news outlets.
Thank you for that, Ted. You've almost entirely set this up for me, but I just want to add, it was a real privilege working on this piece to learn about the elegance of this research paradigm, of which Roger is not only one of the foremost experts, but essentially just invented the field. And it was one of those things that when you read it, you think, oh, right, this is the actually salient way to look at this. It simply hadn't occurred to me before I was working on this piece to ask, not what's happening with the weather, but to what extent is that the most important factor in understanding how it matters to human beings and human civilizations. Roger is the one who really first understood that that was a question that needed to be asked. So Roger, I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Professor with a PowerPoint, watch out.
That's right.
All right. Well, thanks, Ari. Ted, that was great. Hi, everybody. So I'm just going to pick up where Ted left off. And I have some slides. You know, it wouldn't be right if I didn't show you some slides. I'm one of those rare people, I can tell you, at the zenith of my conventional academic career occurred in Washington, D.C. in March 2006. I'll be immodest. I won an award. I won the Roger Revelle Award from the National Academy of Sciences for my research disentangling the societal factors from the climate factors in rising costs of extreme events in the United States. I had a dinner at the Museum of Natural History. I gave a talk to 1,000 people. We sat there with the dinosaurs. People say, was that the members of the Academy? No, it was the real dinosaurs there. 1 month later, An Inconvenient Truth came out. Al Gore's movie. Had the hurricane coming out of the smokestack. It's spinning the wrong way, by the way, just so you know. But I was a witness to this change in the tenor from the idea that climate change is a long-term threat. We're going to have to really make some changes, to the idea that climate change is what you see out your window. That overstates it, but that's kind of the move. And so Ted refers to the Union of Concerned Scientists workshops. There's a number of efforts. It's all out in the open. The idea was we're going to bring climate change home to people by connecting it to the weather they experience, and particularly very photogenic, tragic disasters that occur around the world. In 2013, I gave congressional testimony on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I'll talk a bit about them. Just summarizing what the consensus of the scientific community was. And it wasn't long after I was the subject of an attack by the Obama White House and being investigated by Congress. And so it's been interesting. So I expect, I'm going to talk about this stuff tonight, but I think it'll be a little friendlier afterwards, and I don't expect to be. Here's me at the Earth Day Parade 50 years ago, marching. I think my dad took that. Hi, Dad. All right, so I'm going to just try to help put a little bit of rigor and vocabulary so that when we have our discussion, it'll be a little bit more informed. And let me say, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they don't produce Bibles. They're not perfect, but they do a lot of really good work. And on extreme events in particular, Working Group 1 has been consistent for many decades. And it's an important touchstone for how we talk about these issues. And let me say, everything Ted writes in his piece, you'll see, is consistent with what the consensus of the IPCC has said for a long time. So I'm going to introduce two important words here for our discussion. One is the detection of change. So the IPCC says that if you want to understand climate change, the second word there is change. Climate is the statistics of weather phenomena over a long period of time, typically decades. To detect change, you have to be able to observe it over time. The Earth has warmed. We have detected that. Now, the second part of what's called the detection and attribution framework is the attribution. So once you've detected that something has changed, you ask the question, well, why has it changed? Right? So it's going to get cooler tonight from now in Washington, D.C. And if we're going to attribute that, it's probably because the bright orb that we circle goes up beyond the horizon. The scientific community has worked really hard to attribute changes in global average temperature to various causes, and it turns out carbon dioxide, primarily from the burning of fossil fuels, is a main factor behind the change in global average surface temperature. The reason we know climate change is real is because of the detection and attribution framework. Now, two more words before I jump into just a little bit of data. So a disaster. Ted set this up, but a disaster happens when an extreme event intersects with a vulnerable and exposed society, right? With loss of life, economic damage. We're all familiar with that. A disaster is not the same thing as a weather or climate extreme. And one of the things I've been saying for many decades is that if you want to look for changes in climate variables, look at climate data. Don't look at economic data. Don't look at loss of life. Don't look at people displaced. Don't look at migration. Look at climate data to see climate change. This is a graph showing deaths from disasters, from our world in data. It goes back to the 1900s, I think, early years. This is an annual graph. You don't have to be a sophisticated statistician to see that there used to be millions of people that died every year from disasters. A little known fact is that from the period, if we set aside earthquakes, and I know there was a huge earthquake in Turkey last year, which was horrific and tragic, but if we look at just weather and climate disasters, the period from about 2015 to 2022 had the fewest deaths from weather and climate events in all of recorded human history. It was a huge accomplishment and slipped under the radar. The reason isn't because, well, the climate's become benign or whatever. Ted said we've become much better at preparing and dealing with the consequences of disasters, particularly in poorer places around the world. That's where the most success has happened. If you want to look at loss of life, go to the Bay of Bengal and compare the 1960s to today. It's phenomenal how successful we've been. This is the cost of disasters. This is data kept by the global reinsurance company, Munich Reinsurance. This is the total cost. You can see it goes up to $350 billion at the top there. But there's been an increase in the cost of disasters. And over again, and I'm sure you've seen it, I see it, in the United States, we have a tally of billion-dollar disasters. The idea that we can use economic data to detect and attribute climate change is pretty commonplace. Here's what's really going on. This is Miami Beach, 1926. It's an important year because that's a year, I don't know what that is, a prison or something they had on the beach. Certainly wasn't like it looks in 2022. 1926, there was a Category 4 large hurricane that made landfall over what today is downtown Miami. At the time, it caused a lot of damage. For 1926, about $76 million. Estimates are that if that same storm occurred today, exactly the same storm, same wind speed, same track, it would be approach $300 billion in one event. Again, as Ted said, the most important factor is not the characteristics of the event itself, which may certainly change over time, but it's where we build, how we build, what we build, and how we prepare for extreme events. This is that same data. So I take this data here, and we say, all right, how has that changed in proportion to global GDP? Because we're wealthier. And GDP is a very blunt instrument for doing these sort of adjustments. This is from 1990. You could say, well, maybe it's gone down a little, but I think the story here is that it hasn't changed very much over time. There are places, particularly in poorer parts of the world, where there is a sharp decline because they have a lot more headroom for improving their responses to disasters. This is my last slide. And you may wonder, well, what does the IPCC say about extreme events, about detection and attribution? So this is a summary table that I put together, but you can go to chapter 11 and chapter 12 of the AR6 Working Group 1 report. And if you followed all that, go to table 12.12, where this is all laid out in detail. So have heat waves, have we detected changes in heat waves and attributed them to human-caused climate change? Yes, we have, in fact. There are more heat waves and more intense heat waves. Heavy precipitation. Not everywhere, but in many places, there's been detection and attribution achieved. These are in yellow. But for the headline phenomena like flooding, drought, tropical cyclones and hurricanes, tornadoes, severe storms, there has been no detection or attribution. And the IPCC is quite clear about this. Fire weather, so the conditions that are hot and dry and lead to combustion, that has been detected and attributed to climate change. But fire itself has not. Because why? Because fire is really complicated. It's where humans settle, ignite fires, manage the land, and so on. So it gets really complicated. So one of the things I'll end with is it's really important to separate out impacts from climate when we're talking about these long-term trends. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Roger. Okay, so my next question is for Xuting. And essentially, to put it nicely, the question is, how much does the debate that we're having on this stage, the discussion that we're having on this stage, really matter in terms of how policy is being crafted, right? So what I was, I opened in so many words by saying I commissioned this piece because the New York Times made me mad, which is not always the best state of mind in which to commission a piece. I think it's still an excellent essay. Climate change for me is especially something that I discuss with family and friends. It's salient because individuals are worried about it in their lives and because we hear about it in the news, right? I don't actually have a sense, you are much more plugged into the policy world than I am. I don't have a sense of if this set of discussions, right, catastrophism, the sense that this specific new hurricane was brought about by climate change, if that's actually what's driving the people who are crafting policy ideas and deciding on those and then voting on them. I would be grateful for your perspective on whether these issues are salient to policymaking, and if not, what actually is driving policymakers.
Yeah, thank you, Ari. I would like to first thank you to AEI and the New Atlantis for co-hosting this event. I spent some time reading Ted's essays before joining this event, and I encourage you all to give it a read. It's a fun read. I learned a lot from Ted's analysis, and also he cited a lot of Roger's research. I think there are a lot of factors that are driving policymakers to work on climate issues. To answer your question, I think first of all, being really worried about catastrophic climate consequences definitely is one of the reasons that's driving policymakers to work on the issues. I'd like to give you a quick example. So back in February this year, I was speaking at a climate event next door at Brookings on the stage with Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, who's a champion of climate mitigation policies and a big advocate for economy-wide carbon tax. He was framing his concerns about climate change as the potential human and also economic costs that would be caused by climate change. And specifically, he's pretty worried about the potential housing market crash that could potentially be caused by coastal properties being non-insurable. So we definitely see catastrophic climate consequences are driving some of the policymakers to engage in this area. There are also other factors that are motivating policymakers to work on climate issues. Over the last several years, we see folding climate and international trade and economic goals into climate policies is gaining a lot of traction. So for example, over the last few years, there are quite a few climate and trade carbon border adjustment carbon tariff bills introduced in Congress. And in November last year, Senator Bill Cassidy introduced the first Republican-led climate bill, which is the Foreign Pollution Act that's aimed at addressing climate change in international trade. The narrative of American being the cleanest globally, and let's bring more jobs back to the US and stimulating the economic growth through the climate policy making is getting really popular here in DC. Lastly, I want to highlight another factor that's really motivating policymakers here in DC to work on climate issues. Interestingly, I think that's finding ways to respond to climate policies in foreign countries and foreign jurisdictions. For example, the EU started introducing its carbon border adjustment mechanism back in 2021, which is essentially import taxes, carbon tariffs to be paired back with their domestic emissions trading system. And we see a lot of lawmakers, both from the left and the right, are trying to find ways to respond to foreign policies and therefore engaging in climate policies.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, I have a second round of questions here. I'll remind the panelists we have about, is it 15 minutes left in the panel? We stretch that a little bit, but 15 more or less. I have questions for each of you. You've each argued for what I consider to be either true or just rationally elegant ways of thinking about the climate crisis and what to do about it. Namely, on the one hand, that we should, as I would describe it, think about our response to climate change as more continuous with the kind of activities that humans have always done of improving our resistance to the weather, improving our resilience and technology and adaptation, and strengthening our institutions. And then on the other hand, Xuting, you have advocated for carbon pricing and a carbon tax, which is a solution that I've long liked in a kind of philosophical sort of way. It appeals to me. It's elegant. It seems like it checks a lot of the boxes for what you would want to do. This is a form of pollution, right? And so you put a price on it in the way that we've done with other kinds of waste. In all of these cases, I think there's a gap between the ideal and the kind of messy reality, right? And one of the questions, I'll preview the questions for each of you, and it essentially is going to be, given that these arguments do seem, at least to me, to be persuasive, much more true and ideal than the arguments that we are hearing in mainstream conversation, why is it that they haven't won the day, right? So Ted and Roger, you've been making these arguments for a very long time. The Breakthrough Institute and the eco-modernist movement has existed for 10 or 15 years. Roger, you and Dan Sarowitz were arguing these ideas back in the Atlantic in the year 2000. Back before that, Greg Easterbrook was writing a book on the case for climate optimism or environmental optimism in 1995. I'm sure there are other people who are further back before that. Maybe the article in the New York Times yesterday heralds that the vibe shift is here. Maybe not. I'm going to turn this over to Xuting first to talk about carbon pricing. Why is it that this policy solution hasn't taken off? What would it require? And how much does it come down to there are politicians who maybe like it, but they recognize that the last two elections were decided by 50 to 80,000 voters in the Midwest and the Rust Belt, and they're terrified of losing even one of those, even if they can counsel that it really is the right mechanism for this?
I see. I get to answer that difficult question. That's the first one on the panel. So I would like to, if I may, just read the ending of Ted's essay. I think it's really nicely written, and I can't agree more. Just give me 10 seconds, I promise. Cutting emissions, adapting to a warming climate requires neither bombarding the public with apocalyptic threats nor imposing arbitrary targets and deadlines for the elimination of all fossil fuel energy. Rather, it requires doubling down on the things that we already know work: modernization, adaptation, innovation, and technological changes. And I really appreciate that when I finished reading the essay. And I think Ted really touches upon a really important point. It's really how human beings invest in the infrastructure, institution, and technology, and how we mitigate and adapt to the climate change that would really determine the impact that we'll be incurring. I think the keywords here are really innovation and technological changes. I think, at least in DC, as Ted also analyzed in his another essay, there are regulations, tax subsidies, and then also carbon pricing. At the Niskanen Center, we are advocating for economy-wide carbon tax because we think it's first tech neutral. It's not really picking solar or wind or hydrogen or nuclear energy. We're not picking any types of energy to subsidize and giving a lot of government handouts to. Second is compared to regulation and tax subsidies, carbon pricing, especially in this context, we're advocating for a carbon tax. it's very efficient. It gives businesses and the companies and consumers the flexibilities to make their choices, find the least costly way to decarbonize. Now, I'm sure a lot of you are will ask me this question, well, okay, Shu-Ting, well, how about the political feasibility? Like a lot of the criticism targeted at carbon tax or carbon pricing is say, what if it increases our electricity bills? How about it increases the gas bills? It would hurt low-income families disproportionately. To that, I will answer, I think a lot of the discussions in this space, a lot of the criticism targeted at carbon tax, talking about its regressive impact lacks context. What are you comparing carbon tax to? We heard a lot about carbon tax itself is indeed designed to increase prices, discourage consumption of fossil fuels, energy, and then make companies and consumers switch from more carbon-intensive to cleaner energy sources. A lot of the criticism of a carbon tax focuses on the distributional table, like tax and fiscal policy analysts have been able to produce and detailed effective after-tax marginal after-tax income. But if you look at the Inflation Reduction Act tax credits, billions and billions of dollars, or all the environmental and climate-related regulations, we almost have none of the distributional analysis. So I think a lot of times the criticism of carbon tax is seen as an unfavorable feature, but I would like to argue that it's actually a favorable feature of the text of the policy. We know the actual impacts across all income brackets. There are different ways to recycle the revenue. There are different ways to mitigate the regressive impact.
Thank you very much. That's helpful. Ted, is doom a more appealing vibe? Also, feel free to comment on the carbon tax, but I want to know, is doom just a more interesting vibe than resilience? And if so, how can you change that?
I don't think so. I mean, I think it's a more interesting vibe for a kind of sector of the advocacy community that's very ideologically committed to the idea. And just to tie the carbon pricing conversation together with some of the catastrophizing, I mean, one of the really interesting things, if you go back and you understand and have been witness to sort of the strategic permutations of what we now sometimes call the climate movement, is that if you really want to go, where does this sort of what you observe, I think it's a little more longer term than just like 2020, 2021, everything shifts. I think it's really over the last decade or so that you see this increasingly sort of apocalyptic and confrontational climate movement. And you kind of go, well, where did that come from? How does that happen? And so what it really happens in response to is the failure of the Waxman-Markey cap and trade proposal back in 2009, 2010, the first couple of years of the Obama term. And so, you know, what happens, and this wasn't a carbon tax, but it was a pricing strategy. You know, they kind of, basically, they sort of, you know, kind of make, you know, the House where they can enforce party discipline more easily, they make Democrats go and sort of walk the plank on a carbon price. And then it literally never gets to a vote on the Senate floor. And, you know, it's not the reason Democrats lost both houses of Congress, but it's certainly one factor, and it certainly wasn't popular. So the conclusion that the environmental community draws from this, and a lot of it driven by a report that was done by a political scientist at Harvard named Thea Skocpol, who says, our problem was this was all an inside the Beltway play. It was all too technocratic. It was all too sort of people in rooms like this talking about this, and we need, you know, we need a movement in the streets to go build the political power and sufficiently put pressure on Congress that next time around we can actually get an economy-wide major carbon pricing and regulatory scheme fit for purpose. And so this is literally the thing that Bill McKibben and the folks at UC, everybody goes and reads. And the strategy to get this, and this is really critical, and it also explains a lot of the sort of polarization that has happened over the last decade plus, is to kind of go build what political scientists call an issue public in the Democratic Party to make climate change a sort of litmus test issue for Democrats in the same way that a woman's right to choose becomes, or a right to life on the Republican side, or no new taxes on the Republican side. They turn this in. And then, that is then kind of tied up in this increasingly catastrophic and apocalyptic rhetoric. The intention of all of this is so that when Democrats come and next have an opportunity, have control of Congress and the presidency, that they will, kind of expend the political capital, because a big part of the kind of claim about why the Waxman-Markey effort had failed was that Obama pushed all of his chips into the healthcare reform effort, into Obamacare, instead of the Waxman-Markey bill. And so next time, the climate folks, the environmental movement was next up, and it was going to be, the next Democratic administration would push all its chips in for climate. So this is a quite explicit strategy, explicitly to go get a price on carbon in some form. And so, whether it's like we've succeeded or not, we were absolutely right, because the outcome of all of that, and then what happens is we get to 2020, and Biden wins the election, and Democrats have the opportunity to legislate, and nobody, not the Biden administration, not Nancy Pelosi, not Chuck Schumer, no one is like, you know what, let's go do a price on carbon again. Everyone is like, no way we're gonna go do that. We've seen this movie before, forget it. So even though then the sort of activist climate movement takes credit for the great victory of the IRA that would not have happened without us being all being insanely apocalyptic and sitting in Nancy Pelosi's office, which I don't happen to believe is true. At the end of the day, if you went back and went to why was this strategy, what was the purpose of this strategy in the first place, it completely fails. No one will even talk about a price on carbon, 12 or 15 years later, or whatever it is. So, I think that the case, I've always been an advocate, if you really go to kind of carbon, both the climate activist strategy and the pricing strategy, it's to kind of have this signal to the market that's highly salient. And I completely disagree, and I'm like, if you want to make progress on climate, you need to make both the issue and the policy less salient, not more salient. I call that quiet climate policy. That's the kind of policy that you can kind of sustain for, the generation that it would take to actually really significantly decarbonize the US economy. And so I think, that actually, after IRA, and I think we're going to see a series of readjustments over the next, 4 or 5 years as a bunch of the things that IRA was supposed to do are not working and are not going to work. But I think we'll end up back at that kind of quiet climate policy. I don't think there's any putting the catastrophe genie back in the bottle. There are just too many people who've literally grown up in it now. But I don't think it's going to help us kind of get to a sensible sort of approach to mitigating climate change that is going to prove particularly effective. So.
Thank you. I know we're getting close to Q&A. I'm going to ask another question of Roger, and if we have time, one more of Shitane as well. Roger, I'm going to ask a similar question to you. We were talking about this before the panel a little bit. How do you make salient to people that the thing that they are worried about should be less salient? It seems like almost that there's a certain level of paradox in it. And I've found this. I've been reading, your arguments have been influential. I'm a little bit of a recovering climate catastrophist myself. I have friends who still are, and I find myself repeating your arguments to them. Then there's a certain thing left over. I'll be at home and I've stopped recycling plastic because I now know that's kind of a scam, and I throw it away, and I feel a little odd about doing that. I still recycle. I still consider thrift to be a certain kind of virtue and not wasting, even though I know enough to read that it's not really a land use problem. There's no real problem with it socially defined. I still have a beach town that I go to, and when I go to it, I notice that the beach is much smaller than it was 10 to 15 years ago. I also know it's a migrating island, and that's kind of just part of the way nature works. But the idea that there is something both socially and individually, morally at stake in our relationship to the environment, it's a tough one to shake. I haven't shaked it, and I don't know that I really want to. How do you replace an argument that appeals to people on that level, but tells them it really shouldn't matter to them that much, that their individual virtue isn't at stake?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have any problem with people believing what they want to believe. If somebody wants to believe,
I appreciate that, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, if somebody wants to believe that the latest storm was caused by Exxon, it's fine, believe that. I'm much more interested in sound public national and international policies. So for example, under the Framework Convention on Climate Change, there's a mechanism called loss and damage, which is great. It's focused on the effects of climate, particularly on poorer and developing countries. If we don't understand the causal mechanisms behind why damage occurs, why people die in disasters, and we spend money, if we say, well, if you switch to solar panels on your roof, that's going to help with your disaster outcomes, that's not going to work, right? And if you say, oh, we're going to build a mechanism where you have to prove it was caused by climate change, not El Nino, not climate variability, then we've designed a system that just can't work out in the real world. So I think outcomes matter, and at some level, there has to be some causality in the actions that we take and the real world outcomes that we expect. I don't think there's a particularly, thank goodness, there's not a particularly strong connection between what any of us happen to believe and how policy emerges outside of the sausage factory. People believe all sorts of things, me, you, everybody, that are completely wrong. And we have our causal mechanisms all messed up, and we go out in policies trial and error. I just want to say one quick thing on carbon tax, and this is probably maybe a third perspective. I've been a long time advocate for a carbon tax. I think it's important. I cannot see decarbonization of the economy occurring in the absence of a carbon tax. Hans Werner Sinn in Germany coined this term called the green paradox. It's real simple. Let's say alternatives to fossil fuels start having a greater market share. Then demand for fossil fuels goes down. What happens to their price? It'll go down. It means that renewables and alternatives to fossil fuels will always be fighting against this declining cost of fossil fuels, which will then boost them back up. There has to be a floor price on carbon. The problem is, and I think Ted's history is exactly right, and I think Shuting saying that people don't like the consequences of higher price energy, that's why a carbon tax hasn't sold. The reason is because elegant economic theory has ignored pragmatic politics. People say, well, we need to have a carbon price that's high enough to change people's behavior. Well, guess what? If you do that, they're going to change their behavior, and they're going to change who they vote for. They're not going to go out and all of a sudden say, let's change our energy system. Ted and I and other colleagues a long time ago wrote a paper called the Hartwell paper, in which we advocated for a low carbon price. The existence of a carbon price is far more important than the level. I've advocated for a $1 a ton carbon price. I don't know why the environmental community doesn't push for that. People say it's not going to do anything. It's not going to change anybody's behavior. Yeah, that's the point. A $1 a ton carbon price in the United States raises $30 billion. Right? It's not going to change how people look at energy, but it's a starting point. A $5 a ton carbon tax changes the price of a gallon of gasoline by 4 cents. For most people, that's like this week to next week. That raises $150 billion. If you want to pay for the IRA, which some estimates now are $1 trillion, we're going to need a revenue source. Carbon tax of $5, $7, $10 a ton. You'll know. So the Yellow Vest protest in France, that was because of a proposal to increase the cost of petrol by I think it was 4 euro cent a liter. It didn't take much. When gasoline in the United States hits $4 a gallon, the president pays attention, starts depleting strategic reserves and things like that. So we should have the lowest carbon tax that is politically possible, and then raise it as the decarbonization proceeds. And you know, if you do that, you'll be able to set a floor price on fossil fuels, meaning that alternatives will have a bar where they can exceed.
Thank you. I'm going to ask one last question, then we'll turn it over to Q&A, and this is for Shooting. Let's say, just for the sake of argument, that I've read the first 1,000 pages of the Inflation Reduction Act, but the final chapter is still sitting on my nightstand. Can you give me a summary? What are the major things that it's changed? Are we living in a new policy landscape as a result of the IRA, as I've heard claimed, or is it more incrementalist?
Yes. Let me try to summarize this massive legislation in 30 seconds. Let me try my best. Sorry. So as many of you already know, the IRA includes dozens of clean energy tax credits and a lot of direct spending on climate energy, clean energies. When it was first passed in 2022, the estimated cost for the climate provision was about $400 billion, including both tax credits and the direct climate spending. The CBO updated its estimate earlier this year. It was more than double, about $800 billion. And Goldman Sachs even had an estimate that it's more than $1 trillion, depending on the technology take-up rates of the tax credits. I can't agree with Roger more on the carbon tax side. Thank you for giving me more hope and make me keep focused on my job and keep me going tomorrow when I go back to my desk. I think we need to look at the IRA from different ways. On one hand, it is an implicit carbon price. It is subsidizing clean energy, so it's changing the relative prices of clean energy and fossil fuels sources. So on one hand, with the massive tax credits, it did encourage a lot of private investment, companies moving their plans, EV plans, battery plans to the United States, opening up factories in some of the rest states like Georgia or South Carolina to really take advantage of the credits, open factories here, bring jobs here, produce products. On the other hand, very interestingly, the IRA has a lot of non-climate related provisions. For example, domestic content rules, threshold, income threshold of leveraging the EV tax credits, which is really working against achieving the climate goals. If your policy choice is to use tax credits, you should really focus on getting the credits to as many people as possible, not put so many barriers to it. It has to be American-made, assembled in America, or a free trade agreement that's contracted with America. So the IRA has undergone a lot of implementation challenges and criticisms, specifically by our allies, such as the EU, calling it a protectionist policies. For a lot of the smaller countries who don't have the fiscal capacity to give billions or even $1 trillion handouts to their industries, they will feel like, okay, US would like to do the things its own way, not really following the international trade rules established under the WTO or other things. I think Roger is absolutely correct that the IRA is changing the relative prices, but it's not really pricing per ton of carbon emissions. Yes, consumers might have incentives to leverage the EV tax credit, go out and buy EVs, but they could still be using electricity generated by coal or natural gas. That's not resulting as broad of emissions reduction as economy-wide carbon tax, and also because energy is heavily subsidized. Overall energy might just get cheaper. Yes, some consumers might switch to cleaner energy sources, but they might just increase their overall consumption. So some of the subsidies dollars are definitely wasted in that sense. So last piece that's oftentimes overlooked when people talk about IRA, both at home and abroad, is it does include a methane fee. This is the first time the federal government puts a direct tax or fee or whatever you call it on greenhouse gas emissions, not carbon dioxide, but methane emissions. It's starting about $900 to $1,500, but the base is really narrow. I had a commentary doing the calculation. It's basically targeting 0.4% of the total greenhouse gas emissions in the U.S. And whether if you're complying with the EPA's methane rules, then you'll be exempt from the carbon price. I think I did way over time, but not
That's
too
all
bad,
right.
huh?
We've already blown past that anyway. We're going to do like in Vegas, screw the casino, go all night. No, we'll let you out. Okay, let's open this up to questions. Anyone in the audience? Yes, sir, in the back there.
Hello, good evening. First of all, thank you for the panel. It was incredibly insightful, and I learned a lot today, I can say certainly. I have a question about, the upcoming elections. So many people, they fear that the Democrats might be the only party that we can rely on for actual climate policy. And as you are saying, the IRA might not be the best option, and carbon taxes should be implemented instead. Can we rely on Republicans to do that? Because many people on that side of the government and on that side of the political spectrum are calling for no climate regulation at all. Are you worried about that? Thank you.
I think Shooting actually.
I would like to take that
Yeah,
if I
she's
may.
probably
Feel free to chime in. I think you're definitely on point. I think both politicians at home and abroad are all watching this election, and we're actually dealing with a lot of uncertainties. And it is true that Democrats have indeed been leading the climate conversations in the United States for the last 1 or 2 decades, but I think we've seen very heartening and encouraging shift, at least in some of the Republicans. For example, Representative John Curtis founded the Conservative Climate Caucus back in 2021. Over the last 2 to 3 years, it has more than 81 members in the Conservative Climate Caucus who are all Republican members in the House. If you go to the website, you look at their statements, they're talking about, we believe human activities are causing climate change, global warming. We would like a seat at the table. We're not really supporting big government subsidies or the IRA approach. We would like to engage in the process so we could bring in conservative principles like smaller government, economic growth, jobs. So I think the urge of not ceding to necessarily the liberal or democratic approach, handling climate change really gives them strong incentives to scoot their chairs forward a little bit to the table when they're working on climate policies. And I gave an example, Senator Cassidy's looking to address climate change in international trade, and there are also other bills. Last week, Curtis's House passed a series of geothermal bills looking to simplify some of the regulatory barriers, and we've also seen some interest in permitting reform, making it easier to create energy abundance in the United States. So yes, it is definitely still an uphill battle. Climate science might still be a discussion or question for some Republican lawmakers, but I think there are a lot of them that are willing to acknowledge the issue and have good faith conversations and find useful policies.
Down in front here.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Roger, I loved your phrase about the elegant economic theory running into practical politics. So I'm going to ask you this related question. Is the carbon border adjusted tariff another elegant economic theory that might just find the calculus to get through the political minefield?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I mean, I think a carbon border adjustment mechanism by any economic bloc It's going to be trade policy disguised. And the only way you survive a kind of a trade war that hurts everyone is people come to the table and say, all right, let's agree. I mean, and maybe this is the underlying political theory is let's agree on a carbon pricing mechanism that's applied economy-wide so it's not protectionist policy. I don't know. I do know that there's a lot of people and policymakers who are aware that you can't deal with decarbonization without a carbon price. And so, I'm happy to try if it takes going down the path of trade policy first, and that gets us closer. Well, maybe that's a necessary step. I'm not sure. I wanted to address this question real quick, if I could, Ari. On
Sure.
The polarization on the climate issue is a huge problem. And in American politics, it really takes two to polarize. So if you're a Democrat, you think the Republicans are evil and wrong, and if you're on the other side, it's vice versa. Polarization on the climate issue has been a project at least 30 years in the making. It's a choice. And a lot of us in the expert community, particularly in climate space, have decided that we like polarization. If you take a look at climate discussions among climate scientists, Republicans are evil. And you look at Republicans, climate scientists are evil. We've chosen that. There was a long period, decades, where the left and the right chose not to politicize vaccines. Sure, there were some fringe people who didn't vaccinate their children in places like where I'm from in Boulder. But for the most part, people said, all right, there's a hard line. We're not going to, this is too important. We saw that's broken down in recent years and with consequences for public health. So I don't think it'll take 30 years to unwind polarization on climate, but it's not like we have to expect one party is going to come meet the other one. It's going to take an effort from people who say, all right, enough children. We have to go beyond this polarization, and that's hard work. And it's going to take a very long time. But let me just say, it's important because climate change, to deal with it, is going to take generations. And like Ted said, we need politics that's sustainable over changing presidents, changing Congresses, changing international wars and everything. And we're not remotely close to that right now.
Thank you, Roger. Does anyone have a question for Ted? If you don't, I do. Okay, here.
Well, I could try one.
Please.
Yeah, no, there you go. So, Ted, old pal, I want to play devil's advocate with you for a bit, because I'm in heated agreement with both you and Roger, but...
Steve, we're out of time. Oh.
Yeah, okay. Look, catastrophism and trying to rile up the public is not limited to the environment, right? I mean, I remember joking when half joking when Ted Kennedy died, the people who'd mourn his loss the most were right-wing direct mail houses. And so here's the thing. I mean, I have no love for the Union of Concerned Scientists. But as you guys know, the problem with climate change is it's the wicked problem that we've never had before, one whose time scale is over a century. And so, as for short-term citizens, short-term voters concerned about a penny on the gallon of gas, it's difficult to build a political consensus to do anything. And so I guess if I'm a Union of Concerned Scientists person, what I'd say to you is, yeah, okay, true, the carbon price tactic going back to wax and mark, yeah, it didn't work. And I'm all for quiet climate policy. I totally get it. I'm totally down with it. But it seems to me a Union of Concerned Scientists person would say, you wouldn't even have that, would you, if it hadn't been for our pressure and our decision to turn up the heat, so to speak. In other words, so that's a direct challenge, but the other version of that question for anybody is, if you're not going to play that kind of politics, which, as I say, goes across all domains of issues, how would you persuade the public? What would be compelling for the public to say, yes, we want to start taking some serious steps on energy and have an energy In other words, it seems to me the UCS and others have a very valid claim that whatever momentum we now do have for energy transition was the result of their hysterics. I'll put it that way.
So, yeah, thank you for bringing UCS into the room and giving a voice. It's unfortunate that it's harder and harder to find spaces where I could have that conversation with someone from UCS. What I would say is this. The first thing is, it's a little bit like the idea that without climate change, there would be no hurricanes. I think there's this idea that, and this is at the bottom of the claim, is that if you didn't have an apocalyptic climate and environmental movement, there would be no climate or environmental movement at all. And I don't believe that's the case. In fact, I think we have seen lots of progress on lots of environmental issues without that. And in fact, if you go to the Obama era, we got, depending on how you counted, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act spent something like $200 billion on various sorts of clean energy and climate-related technology and infrastructure, with a far less apocalyptic climate movement. So, you can kind of go, well, but 395 is like twice that a decade later. But the question you have to ask yourself is, would a less apocalyptic and less polarizing climate movement have gotten more or less out of a Democratic administration? And would the things that it got have been either A, more effective, or B, more sustainable? And I think the answer to all of those things is yes. In fact, interestingly, Manchin originally put 1.5 trillion on the table. The environmental community would not take yes for an answer, insisted that they would put so much pressure on the senator from West Virginia, who had gotten elected to the Senate, literally running against the Waxman-Markey bill. The result of this is that they actually got far less money out of the final package than Manchin than the piece of paper that Manchin had signed his name to almost a year before, saying this is the most I will do. So I think that, I'll say two things just to conclude. One is, I don't believe that's the case. I think that the kind of craziness and the polarization actually has sort of taken a bunch of things that were quite popular, from renewable energy to electric vehicles to induction stoves and heat pumps, and turned them into culture war objects. The polarization of the issue, you said something to me years ago that I never forgot. You said to me, we get a lot further on climate change if it was more like the education debate, where you had sort of a Republican education position that was like, teach the fundamentals and, have higher standards and things like that. And you had a Democratic version of it, which was like pay the teachers more and have smaller class sizes. And that's a place from which you can have like negotiation, and you get various things that might not be the be-all and end-all of policy, but at least like both parties have some skin in the game. And what we have now is a thing where it's like you're either a denier or you're alarmist, depending on which side of the thing you sit on. You're for climate policy or against it. And so what happens is when power changes, like the other guys have a very strong incentive to go undo everything that, so Obama does the Clean Power Plan, Trump undoes it. Now Biden has a new Clean Power Plan with another name that I can't remember right now. And if Trump wins in November, they will go and undo it. And this is what we've kind of created as a result of the polarization, which I think it's not entirely the fault of one side, but I do think that actually the climate movement had an intentional strategy to polarize the issue. It was not sort of an accidental thing. It was to create that issue public. And I think the sort of situation where if Republicans come in, the first thing they're going to do is try to undo most of the stuff that the Biden administration did over the last 4 years is a result of that.
I think that's actually a good place to wrap the panel. Thank you, Ted. I'm just going to put in a plug. Read the essay. You wouldn't think of an issue like this could be fun to read about, but it is fun to read. It was fun to work on, not all the time, but mostly. And it's the first time that we've ever put an image on the cover of the New Atlantis, so that tells you how special it was. There are copies at each of your tables. I encourage you to take them. There's extra ones in the middle. If you're reading online, go read it online. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you to the American Enterprise Institute and to Tony Mills for helping organize.